Yep.
Very good. There we go. Um, what what I want to share with you today is kind of a systems thinking approach to community economic development. And there's two that we're going to be talking about. One is the I imagine that most of you have seen these before, so this is hopefully just going to be kind of a review of what these things are and how they can be used as a tool to kind of help you think about as you're working in the. Okay? One of the things that we have to think about is that everything is kind of interconnected. And as an economist would say, is everything is endogenous. Actually, we don't have things that just fall out of the sky, except for things like the coronavirus. Generally, everything is interconnected. And in the field of community economic development, we've kind of gone through a couple of different ways of thinking about economic development. The first way was in post-World War II, we tended to focus very narrowly on recruitment. Shoot anything that flies, claim anything that lands, and that can be traced back to the Mississippi Balancing Agriculture and Industrial Act. The idea is that the way that we promote economic growth within our community is that we steal businesses from our neighbors. And that was it. That's how we focused on it. In the 1960s and 70s, though, the rise of the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, and everything, we started to take a more holistic approach. We started thinking about, as we promote, if we recruit a manufacturing firm, how is that going to affect the environment and things? So we started thinking in a more holistic way. In the 1980s and 1990s, we swung away from a holistic approach because it was just too unmanageable. There were too many moving parts. It was really hard to get our head around it. So we kind of focused back in on kind of business development and generating employment opportunities. Over the last 2 decades, we've started to move back to a holistic approach, but we're doing it within the systems thinking approach. And there's a couple of tools that are out there to help us think about systems thinking. Part of the challenge is that it's impossible to work on the whole puzzle at once. You kind of need to focus your attention on particular pieces of the puzzle with the realization that there are other pieces on the board there. And how do these systems thinking approaches? Okay. There's just too many pieces. I'll skip through that. The systems thinking approach is kind of focusing on the elements of the systems that are interconnected and how they influence each other. Okay? The systems thinking approach is kind of an idea, a way of kind of structuring it so that we can identify and see what those reinforces and balancing acts are. How are these systems kind of reinforcing each other? How are they balancing each other? And attention to feedback, that if you tweak one part of the local community, it's going to affect other parts. You have to kind of keep that in mind. And there's 3 ways to do it. One is a hard systems thinking. And this is one where it's kind of a closed system, and we kind of can put our head around it. Think about like weather systems and things like that. The idea is that we can kind of actually model this thing, and we can do a fairly good job modeling this thing. The computing power that we have now is just phenomenal. You go back to weather forecasting, and I'm going to date myself here, but if they were able to forecast tomorrow's weather, they were doing a pretty good job. Now they can go out 2 weeks, and it's because they've been able to develop these systems of the weather system of climate and model that. There are soft systems out there. These are not as easily quantifiable, particularly when people are involved. Because when people are involved, they're not always rational. They don't always behave the way the quote-unquote model says it's going to over a higher. People change their taste and preferences over time, and that kind of leads to an evolutionary system. Not only is it a soft system in the sense that it's really kind of hard to model it, like a weather system or something like that, but it's constantly changing over time. How people think and act changes over time. what is the idea of the American dream. The idea of the American dream is constantly changing, and that causes our system and the way that we approach community economic development to change over time. The way that community development, I kind of think about it, is that it's truly an interdisciplinary approach. And this way of thinking about it, for example, say the community wants to tackle if you ask an economist how that works, you're going to get something about labor markets and worker productivity. If you talk to a sociologist, you're probably going to get an answer about culture and how people are raised and how people interact with each other from a cultural perspective. If you ask a political scientist, they're going to talk about kind of the institutions of government and who has the ear of the decision makers, the policy makers. If you talk to folks out of education, they're going to talk about the school system and how the school system works. Now the thing is that is any one of them right and the other's wrong? No, they're all right. The problem though is that if you try to tackle poverty, you try to keep all these different perspectives in your head at once. Unless you're Einstein, you can't keep all these things in your head. You have to kind of come at it from a particular disciplinary lens with the realization that these other things are in place. Okay. Now, here are some examples of systems thinking approaches that I found. And, my perspective on this is good luck. These really kind of look like explosions in a lumberyard. But if you were to model weather, for example, this is the kind of systems thinking approach that you have to lay out. And you can actually empirically measure these things. The problem, though, is that this is more confusing than it is helpful. At least it is to me. Good luck with this. This is one.
Steve, can I stop you? Steve, can I stop you for a second? I think your microphone is starting to fade in and out.
Is it?
Yeah. I'm sorry to stop you.
Okay, I'll just speak up a little bit.
Okay.
This is a systems thinking approach that was put together by the food systems team to think about local food systems. This is actually something that Alfonso Morales was kind of involved in putting together. And he thinks this kind of captures everything here. I think this is just a prettier representation of kind of the systems thinking in the previous slide. It's just kind of, there's too much there. Some folks like this. It's a way to kind of visualize all the different pieces that are moving around. I tend to like to think of it as, try to get something as simple as possible. There are too many parts here. Okay? So there's a trade-off between the complexity of the tool and the completeness of the tool and how useful the tool is. So I like to kind of err on the side of perhaps simplicity, perhaps moving it to the side of, we don't have all the different pieces that are specifically modeled up, but we have all the major components here. The two that I kind of want to go over real quickly are kind of the Schaefer Star and the Flores Community Capitals. And I think that all of you have seen these before, particularly the Flores Community Capitals, because it's getting used a lot in the community development field. Okay. Let's go over the Schaefer Star first. There's really kind of 6 components. The first component is resources. This is really kind of the resources that are at the disposal of the community. Generally, as an economist, we think in terms of labor, capital, technology, things like that. Healthcare system, the education system, manufactured goods, agricultural products, all the different resources that are used in the production of economic activity within the community. Labor often refers to the people that are actually working the community. These could be people that are working in the community. They could be commuters. Some of the work that Matt Kears has been doing on commuting sheds has kind of shown that, the days of people living in one place, working in one place, shopping in one place, going to church in one place are gone. We live here, we work over there, we shop over here, and we don't go to church anymore. So the notion of labor is we need to think a little bit broader than simply within the community. Capital refers to a couple of different things here. One is kind of natural capital, things as land, water, forests, natural resources. Artificial capital refers to things like buildings, equipment, road, fiber optics, broadband, things like that. So when we're thinking about capital, for example, how do we use capital? This is where we can get into conflict within the community. When the frac sand mining thing was coming out, there was a lot of conflict over what is the best use of that resource. Do we dig it up and sell it, or do we maintain the natural environment? There's a lot of conflict in the western part of the state over what we do with that natural capital. Forests, do we cut them down, or do we use them for resource or forest or tourism and recreation, things like that? So it's a way to kind of help us think about what are the resources. Technology, technology is kind of how we combine labor and capital into whatever it is we're producing. And this is something that is kind of the driver of economic growth, is really advances in technologies, advances in innovation. Okay. So the idea here is that, can we use new technologies to kind of have our cake and eat it too? Can we improve economic well-being without consuming the resources that are at our disposal? Yeah. A lot of folks think that how we use those resources is really at the core of community economics. Shifting from a goods-dependent economy to a service-producing economy. Shifting away from cutting the trees down to recreation and tourism. The movement away from mining to a retirement migration. For kind of how we use those resources is fundamental to how the economy functions and the competition within the uses of those different resources. So the key is to ask, what are the resources or the assets at the disposal of the community, and how can we use them for the greatest economic opportunities? What's the best use of our resources? And because technology is changing, the optimal use of those resources are changing over time. The markets mode. What we're really talking about here is supply and demand. When Ron Schaefer put this together, he was thinking in terms of internal markets and external markets, kind of the local markets and the export market. I think that's too narrow. I think what we're really talking about here is that we live in a capitalist economy, and we need to think about what is happening to the demand for the goods and services the economy is producing. And those. What are our competitors doing? What's the logic behind the factors that drive supply and demand? One of the things that really kind of comes into play here is the notions of growth theory and firm location theory, inter-industry linkages, things like agglomeration economies, internal and external economies of scale. So thinking about how the economy grows through a capitalist system kind of helps us think through what's happening to the local economy. One of the things that we're struggling with in CCED right now is trying to come up with a way to measure what's going to be the economic impact of this COVID-19. And it's not easy to think through because there's so many moving pieces. We're having a really hard time getting a handle on, how many manufacturing firms are shutting down because their input supply chain has been disrupted. How many agricultural farmers are losing sales because our exports have been shut down. Not that the demand has changed, but we simply can't physically ship the material anymore. It's really difficult to disentangle all these pieces. And that's kind of what a systems thinking approach helps us do, is to kind of think about what are all the different pieces that we need to be thinking about. One of the keys here is the realization that there are forces that are going on beyond our control. One of the things that is, the pandemic that's occurring right now, that's beyond our control. We can't do anything about it other than stay at home and try to spread. But things like this happen. It's really important for the community to think about what's within its control and what's outside of its control. One of the things that I've seen over the years that I've been in Wisconsin is how dairy farmers have shifted in how they think about the price of milk. One of the things they used to complain about all the time was the price of milk, it's too low, it's too low. There's been a transition there. They're starting to realize that complaining about the price of milk doesn't do them any good. What do they have control over? They have control over the cost of operation. So that shifting of their energy away from something that they have no control over to something that they do have control over really kind of helps them focus their energy. And I think that's something important for a community to realize. What do they have control over and what don't they have control over? Rules. The rules are the institutions. It's the rules of the game. Rules are important because they govern what we can do with markets, resources, and space. A lot of times you hear in terms of like a positive business climate. One of the ways that we can promote a more positive business climate is to cut regulations. We cut the rules. We cut the amount of rules that businesses have to follow. And by doing that, we loosen up their flexibility to function. We reduce their costs. Part of the thing is, though, is that the rules and those regulations establish what you can and cannot do. Within a framework of certainty, risk, and uncertainty, rules of the game actually kind of put some parameters on risk. We know what we can do and can't do because of what the regulations say. It's actually removing a certain amount of uncertainty, which is bad for the economy. So the rules are really very important here. So when we think about the rules, we can think about these rules as kind of a positive thing. Now, the society node, I'm going to come back to this in a minute. The society node, this is something that we really had a hard time. When Dave Marcoulier and I were working with Ron on recrafting this thing, he had the society node and the rules node as one. So it was a diamond rather than a star. And we debated with him about really breaking up that into two different components. And the reason that we wanted him to break it up is because there's really kind of two sets of rules. There's the formal rules, which is kind of what's established in law, what's the regulations. Then there's the informal rules. The informal rules are kind of the norms of acceptable behavior. That's really kind of, and the reason Ron was kind of pushed back on this is because that's kind of the realm of culture. It's the realm of sociologists. It's not really the realms of economists. It's what we call soft variables. They're squishy. I think these informal rules are very important because the work that some of us, Tessa Conroy, for example, and I have been doing on the role of social capital. When you think about social capital, and notions of bridging social capital and bonding social capital, a lot of that's falling into the society node or the informal rules. One of the things that we're finding, for example, is that some communities in Wisconsin have very strong bonding social capital. They have a very strong sense of belonging within that community, which can be good because it establishes networks, it establishes norms of behavior. But they really lack in terms of bridging social capital, reaching outside of their community. And the way that you can see this is whether or not, how are people that move into the community received? Are they welcomed into the community and accepted into the community? That's strong bridging social capital. Or are they kind of viewed as you're from away? And this is something that I think a lot of communities in Wisconsin really suffer from, is that if you're not from here, if you're not a fifth generation from Badgerville, then you're not really one of us. And that's really very bad for the community. It's an attitude. It's difficult to measure. You can't put a t-test on it, but I think it's something that is extremely important. And it's something that we're putting more and more time in trying to understand. Decision making. This is really kind of the ability of the community to separate out problems and symptoms. The classic example is being able to separate out red herrings. The classic example is when the Supermax prison was being located. The state had said, we're going to build a Supermax prison, the one that went into Bostonville. And they essentially put up a call for proposals. Which communities would like to host this? There was one community that I was doing a little bit of work with, and a community hearing, a community meeting kind of broke down because somebody said, I don't want this in my community because it will cause my children to get AIDS. And it's like, what? Well, these are hardened criminals. These are drug users. These are rapists. They have AIDS. And a mosquito, this is the logic, a mosquito will fly into this prison, bite them, and then bite my children and give them AIDS. The whole community conversation broke down over that, okay? Now, decision-making is really kind of speaking to the ability of the community to not get derailed by these red herrings, to not get, to be able to kind of get past the symptoms and get down to the underlying problems, okay? The other thing here is, does the community involve a wide spectrum of interest, or is it just a select few? Is it the good old boys who kind of are making the decisions? We all know that for effective community development, community economic development, there needs to be a mechanism for everybody's voice to be heard. But effective leadership essentially says, how can we have that conversation but not get it derailed? For example, one of the things that I've kind of heard is the housing issue that's popped up. We're hearing a lot of communities struggling with housing issues. Either the housing is too expensive or the housing is not very good quality, okay? So we need to tackle housing. The question that I ask is it that we have a housing problem, or is it that we have a job problem? That we have, our housing is not affordable, not because it's too expensive, but because we have really low paying jobs in the community? Is it that we have really low quality housing because the types of jobs that we have in the community can only pay low rents, and that results in low quality housing? So the ability then to kind of, say, peel back the layers of the onion to get to the actual underlying problems. This requires effective leadership. Fostering community citizen input, participation, clearly depends on the social capital. One of the things that you'll notice here is that we've kind of broken these out into individual nodes, but there is overlap. Effective leadership requires effective social capital, social node, society node of the star. Okay. Space. This is something that we kind of complete here in the sense that the community doesn't live in isolation. It's part of a larger economic system. One of the things that has really been a positive outcome of Michael Porter and his introduction of clusters, and this is something the regional economists have been very upset with over time, is that we kind of said that, Michael Porter hasn't introduced anything new. What Michael Porter's been talking about in terms of economic clusters has been around for 50 years, more than 50 years. What Porter has done is that he's gotten practitioners and community members and community leaders to understand that they're part of a larger economic system. The economy doesn't stop at the municipal or the county. That actually they're part of a larger system. And what we've seen is more and more communities that are moving towards collaboration in terms of economic development. And I think that's a very positive thing. We're looking at this not so much from my community versus your community, but how can we work together to improve the economic well-being of the area? And that work that Matt's doing on commuting patterns really kind of drives that home. So the Schaefer star, what's the summary here? It's essentially a tool to help us get our heads around it, okay? It's kind of a thing that you can put up on the billboard, on your bulletin board, and kind of think about as the community struggling with an issue, how does it fit in here, and how are the different elements of this particular issue affecting other elements? How can I come at this issue from kind of a holistic approach or a systems thinking? The other one here, I think, is the florist capitals. This is the one that's been getting a little bit more attention. And I think it's partially because Jan has been very aggressive in kind of putting this out there. It's been embraced by some folks. But what they're essentially saying is that we economists kind of accuse Jan and Neil as thinking like economists here, because they're thinking about, what's the economic output of the local economy? The local economic output depends on the inputs of the different capitals of the community, okay? So kind of like the way that the Schaefer Star thinks about the resources in a more traditional economic way, the Flores Community Capitals is kind of taking that resources component and they're blowing it out into a broader perspective. So The key here is we want vibrant communities. And what do we mean by vibrant communities? We want resilient communities. How fast is the community going to bounce back from this coronavirus scenario? How fast can the community bounce back from a major employer shutting down or a natural disaster like a tornado coming through? How fast are they able to? A lot of the research is suggesting that it's things like in economic mix, how diversified is the local economy. A lot of it hinges on social capital. The levels of social capital within the community really is a major driver of resiliency. Entrepreneurial. When we say entrepreneurial, the first thing that pops into people's minds is businesses, new business startups. But that's only one part here. Entrepreneurial really is kind of thinking about new ways of tackling old problems. Okay, that can be social entrepreneurship, it could be political entrepreneurship, it could be economic entrepreneurship. What we're talking about here is the willingness to try new ideas, the willingness to learn from mistake, the willingness to change and to embrace change and try to drive that change. Innovative. This is a key element of entrepreneurship, is being innovative, of seeing that new idea, of developing that new idea, and willingness to try to implement that idea, and to admit when it doesn't work and to learn from those mistakes, but yet continue to move forward and try new ideas. Looking forward and not looking backwards. What can we do to help our community today so it's a better place for our kids 10, 20 years from now? Looking forward, not going, well, back in the good old days, we used to have this and we used to have that. Okay? We also had the Spanish flu that killed how many thousands and thousands of people. Okay? Do we want growth or development? Okay? We could spend all day talking about the difference between growth and development. Growth, a lot of times, is what economists like to focus on because we can measure it. We can measure more jobs, more people, more income. We can measure those things. Development really is kind of a quality of life component. Do you need to have growth in order to talk about development? When we were rewriting the textbook, Ron Schaefer and Dave Marcoulier and I, we would spend hours debating about whether or not you have to have growth in order to have development. And we never did come to an agreement. But I think most communities, what they're thinking about is they want to create economic opportunities for folks within the community. They don't want to just grow for the sake of growth because they want to maintain the character of their community, but yet they want their community to be vibrant. Is it determined by the community? The community really needs to be in the driver's seat here. They need to be the ones making the decisions. This is that. Okay? So human capital. Let's go through the different capitals here real quickly. Human capital. The skills and the abilities of people, education, problem-solving abilities, and critical thinking. Okay, this is something that has been around in economics for a number of years, is that human capital really matters. The reason is because the engine of economic growth is innovation. Innovation comes from what people do. Innovation isn't things that just fall out of the sky. Okay, so we want effective leadership, we want effective innovation, we want effective entrepreneurial. We need to think about people and the resources of the people. Now, the problem that we have is how do we measure that? Okay, historically, we measure it by education attainment. Okay, the problem though is that do you need a college degree to be successful? Okay, as university people, we should say yes, because that gives us student tuition money, which helps us do our job, but not necessarily. You look at some of the most successful people in the U.S. They don't have a college degree. Henry Ford never attended formal education. He never went to school, but yet we still have Ford Motor Company today. Okay. My sister, I pick on my sister. She barely made it through high school, but she runs a very successful business. Okay. Formal education helps, but it's not necessary. Okay. Human capital also refers to leaders' ability to lead across differences. Okay. Conflict resolution. How many of you have found that training in conflict resolution is vital to being effective in your job. Okay. I think that this is, if there's a professional development opportunity here, Brandon, if you're still listening, I think anything that we can do in terms of additional training on conflict resolution would be really, really useful. Financial capital. This is essentially, when I teach this in my class, I basically call this section, it's all the banker's fault. Unfortunately, we seldom have enough money on hand to do what we need. We need access to the financial markets. We need access to capital. How are the financial markets working? Okay. Are they effective? From a community development perspective, the argument really here is what are your local financial institutions doing? Are they at the table? Are they providing the services that the community needs? If they're not providing the services that the community needs, perhaps you want to create a credit union or something like that. Okay? But a lot of what's happening in the financial markets is happening outside of the community. Okay? A lot of the rules and the regulations are coming down from the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, the state regulators. Okay? But how effective are bankers in terms of working with local businesses? A lot of times it's essentially, if I'm trying to start a business and I go talk to the local banker, what kind of reaction do I get? Do I get a simple, no, there's the door, bye, don't let the door hit you on the way out? Or does the local banker say, you know, you're not ready yet to apply for a loan. What you need is to think through this, this, and this. Here's a business card for the local SBA. Here's a business card for the local Economic Development Corporation. Here's a business card from the local extension office. Go talk to these folks. They will help you further flush out your business plan, okay? Business incubators. One of the more effective business incubators are ones that actually bring in, say, a local banker, a small business banker, who says they're going to come in and they're going to spend a couple of hours every other Friday, and they're going to work with the local businesses in the incubator to help them think through their finances. Not to do it for them, but to help them think through, kind of be a coach, if you will. Build capital. This is kind of the infrastructure, if you will. These are roads, bridges, sewer treatment systems. This is the public capital that's in the Schaefer Stone. Okay. The one that we're seeing right now is the need for broadband. I think that this telecommuting and commuting from home kids that are homeschooling now, I think our access to broadband is just being driven home right now. And that's a built capital. And I think that broadband is something that we're going to have to spend some time on and use this as an opportunity to revisit those conversations. The other problem with build capital is that this is where we get a lot of discussion in terms of taxes are too high. How do we pay for this build capital? Well, a lot of times we do it through taxes. Well, we all know that taxes are bad for the economy. Well, not necessarily, because these taxes pay for these services. So we have to be able to have a conversation within the community of what is the state of the services that's built capital, and are we willing to tax ourselves in order to provide for this built capital? I think this is a very important indicator of the business climate. Rather than just simply cut in the name of lower taxes, how effective are we? How strategic are we in investing our taxes in our public infrastructure? Natural capital. This is where Wisconsin has a comparative advantage over a lot of states, particularly Illinois, and I'll pick on Illinois because I'm from. Wisconsin is blessed with a lot of natural resources. Historically, we have extracted those natural resources. We have cut down the trees, we have dug up the sand and the minerals, we have farmed the land. But increasingly, as tastes and preferences change, is there another use of those natural resources? The frac sand mining debate was really those two things kind of at a loggerhead. Historically, we would just dig it up. But a lot of folks had moved into the western part of the state where there's a lot of sand. Folks had moved in there because of the natural resources. They had moved in there because of the scenic beauty. They had moved in there because of the wildlife. What's the best use of that alternative? those different uses. Now, the key is how can we have our cake and eat it too? Okay, how can we have an effective sand mining operation, but yet still have a recreation-dependent economy? Okay, how can we do that? I think we can do that. For the frac sand mining, a lot of times what it boiled down to was the truck traffic. There was concern over the truck traffic, and that kind of gave them something that they could zero in on and focus their energy on. Social capital. We've already talked about social capital. I won't spend a lot of time on this again, but again, we've got bonding social capital. How strong does the community feel about itself? Bridging is moving outside, and I think that bridging, that's where the border clusters has come in. I think that a lot of people now are starting to realize that they need to work with neighboring communities. I think how weak as extension can help facilitate it, I think is really important. A lot of the research that's coming down now is starting to suggest that bridging social capital is actually more important than bonding social capital when it comes to economic performance. Culture, how we know the world. My wife is a sociologist, and whenever I talk about culture, she always says I'm talking about it wrong. What we're saying here really is that it's kind of how the community views itself. What are the influences? What voices are heard and listened to? Okay, this is kind of akin to the society note of the Schaefer star. What's acceptable behavior? What's not acceptable behavior? How do we kind of celebrate our history, our traditions, and things like that? Political capital. This is linked to the Schaefer decision-making node, but this is really the ability to make decisions, the ability to tap into a leadership pool, the ability of volunteerism. Political capital is almost the antithesis of apathy within the community. One of the problems that, as an economist, that I struggle with is if the community is apathetic, they're stuck. They can't do anything. Political capital kind of speaks to, and that cultural capital speaks to, the ability of the community to kind of rally itself together, okay? The other thing here with political capital is tapping into other units of government. You know, it's amazing to me when you talk to a community and you think about, okay, we're going to form a team to address a particular issue. Have you thought about asking somebody from the local legislative office or the local Senate office or the congressional representative or one of the US senators to be involved? Okay. When the community responds back, oh, geez, would they be interested? Answer is yes, they should be. And you should be reaching out to them. So in a nutshell here, what these two systems thinking approaches do is essentially provide a framework that we can think about the different elements that we can think through these different elements that affect the community well-being, okay? They're not these explosions in the lumberyard. Perhaps they're overly simplistic, but I like that. I think the beauty's in the simplicity of these things. These are the kind of things that you can wrap your head around, and you can tackle almost any community, any issue in the community within one of these frameworks. So I'm going to leave it there and see what kind of conversation we might have.
Thank you, Steve. Everyone, your mics are on mute. If you can have the ability to unmute yourself. So let's ask away.
Thank you, Steve. This is Sherry Gruder. I'm so glad you're doing this because this is how anyone in sustainability thinks. It's all systems approach, and it does look at all the forms of capital, and it's actually the framework by which to move forward. So I appreciate the capital models and how they work. The question, well, not so much the question, but the challenge is getting institutions, whether they're businesses or governments or anyone else, to make decisions that look at all of those parts and not just things like the simple bottom line. And so in working with the city of Madison years ago, when they adopted sustainability and systems approaches, we actually created a worksheet for any project being done in the city, where it actually looked at the systems. Are you looking at the natural, social, and economic capital parts of the project? And they had to fill it out. And if it didn't touch all of them, and they also hadn't talked to 3 other departments about it, that the project didn't go through. So anyway, that was just an example of, it is very complicated, but people need tools to be able to actualize it.
I think that's a good point. I think with businesses, more and more businesses are moving towards the triple bottom line approach, which is a little bit simpler. I know that a lot of businesses are thinking about, how can they be better corporate citizens? And, the triple bottom line is kind of, profits, environment, community, or society. And they kind of use that lens to help think through. And I think the simpler you can keep it, the better. That's why those examples that I used earlier that looked like explosions in a lumber yard, I think they do more damage than good because they make it overly complex. A while back, we had developed a tool for doing fiscal impact assessment. It was called Assessing the Impact of Development. And at the very end of it, we had a one-page template that kind of had 5 columns across the top. It was economic, fiscal, social, environmental, and I think there's one more. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. And then there were rows. One was how is this going to positively affect that particular element? And you gave it a letter grade A, B, C, D, E, F. How is this going to negatively affect the community? And then strategies for improving the grades. And it was one page. And it kind of was a way to think about, okay, we're thinking about allowing this development to occur. And it helps us think through, not just that it's going to have a physical impact on the local government, but it's going to have these other impacts. It's a tool to help them think through. One page, short and sweet.
Oh, just to say that the way businesses look at it is people, planet, and profits, or 3 E's: equity, environment, and economy.
The bottom line is still going to drive a lot of this because if the businesses aren't profitable, they won't be around. So that's still going to be the bottom line, but they're becoming more sensitive to the fact that they're a member of the community. And, I think that a lot of times, the community sometimes need to make a tough decision. If they got a business that's threatening to leave and are basically extorting the community for resources, I think going through kind of this triple bottom line approach or this little one-page spreadsheet, and saying, maybe we'd be better off if they left. That's a tough decision to have. But I think that sometimes thinking this thing through, they might come to conclusions that they wouldn't if they were just merely focused on, we're going to lose jobs. We're going to lose tax base. It's like, well, there are other things that are perhaps equally important.
And Steve, I'm sure many of you on the call are probably aware of this, but Larry Fink, who's if I'm not mistaken, the world's largest asset manager for BlackRock, puts out a letter every year. And oddly enough, the corporate community tends to change at least messaging, and oftentimes will actually change formal procedures and rules and so forth. But this year's statement in January was related to taking sustainability and principles of sustainability much more serious. And after that letter was released, you started to see some of the biggest companies in the world. Many of them are actually doing pretty hardcore changes to their kind of the way they operate. Others are greenwashing, but I think that people are seeing the value of it because there's many, especially millennials and younger generations, are making decisions that aren't necessarily in alignment with that kind of bottom line, the financial bottom line. And this, I think Larry Fink's letter was really kind of keeping in line with that to say, if you're going to be profitable and continue to manage into the future, you need to take these principles serious beyond just greenwashing.
I think I think that there was, when we saw a real big movement in like organic agriculture and sustainable agriculture was when Walmart came out and basically said, we want to start promoting that the produce and the foods that you buy in super Walmarts are grown sustainably and organic. And the reason they did it is because they saw a marketing opportunity. It was the bottom line was driving it. But when Walmart made that decision, then suddenly, all sorts of dominoes started falling, and you started seeing this tremendous growth in organic and sustainable practices because Walmart basically said, that's what we want.
What Larry Fink was saying is that there are other economic costs, and he was looking at the risks and the costs of climate change, and that was going to affect all businesses in all markets, and therefore had to be taken into account. And I think, that those externalities are now needing to be incorporated because the health impacts and the costs related to that, and the costs of disasters and recovering from them is just too huge for society to take on. So there are those bigger messages. And it's good for the bottom line.
You're right, Sherry, and we're going to see this play out differently across the world. There's a interesting book that's out that's called The Varieties of Capitalism, and it basically argues that our world economy is a capitalist economy. That's how we've set up the economy. But when you look at how different countries implement capitalism, there's big differences across the world. For example, in the US, we have a very short planning horizon. We're targeting quarterly numbers. Planning 2 years down the road is just unheard of. If you go to Europe, they're looking at 5 years down the road, 5 years to 10 years down the road. You go to Asia, they're looking 10 to 20 years down the road. So I think that you're right. Companies are looking at this. They're looking at their bottom line. But unfortunately, in the US, because we have such a high discount rate, we're like, geez, that's not going to have an effect for another 10 years. We'll worry about it in 10 years, which is a problem.
So other questions? If not, I'll pose one to the group. So we have a mix of educators who've been doing this for a while on the Zoom today and some newer educators on the Zoom today. So I'll ask, for those of you that have been doing extension for a while, how have you used the community capitals? And for those of you that are just coming on board as extension educators, what are some of the things that you're curious about how community capitals play out in a day-to-day or a month-to-month sense when you're working with communities? This is like when I used to teach, everyone jumps at once.
I'm talking too much.
This is Madeline Roberts. I am very new and have limited background in economic development, but one thing that I think concerns my area up here in Washburn County, Northwest Wisconsin, very high in that natural resources, but there's still a concern about being overly dependent on tourism. So when I'm having conversations with people, it's always, well, how do you find that balance of attracting sort of a more stable job situation as opposed to the ups and downs of tourism? We had good snow, bad snow, all of that.
Is the concern that the economy is too seasonal or it's too specialized? They need to diversify, or is it both?
Possibly both. Again, I don't have that economic development background, so this is all new to me, but this is kind of what I'm taking in and trying to see what might be my role in helping. So that's why the system thinking is very, I have a natural resources background. That's the majority of my work is focused on that. So that's the lens I'm coming at it with.
Todd, correct me on this, but when we did Sister Bay, up in Door County, not Sister Bay.
Bailey's Harbor.
Thank you. That was their concern, is that they were too dependent on a seasonal tourist economy. And one of the things they wanted to try to do was to broaden it out to be more of a year-round economy. And the way that they were thinking about it was telecommuting. Is how can we encourage people to move to Door County, to move to Bailey's Harbor, and then enjoy this wonderful natural resource, this beautiful area, and telecommute. And the wall that they hit was broadband. So one of the things that you might be thinking about is, seasonal housing turning into retirement housing, turning into home-based businesses, turning into being able to telecommute and things like that. This is where broadband is becoming necessary. It's not sufficient, it's necessary, you've got to have. But I'd look at home-based businesses that can telecommute and things like that. It's built off that natural resource.
Well,
Right,
the other part of the Bailey's Harbor story also was the fact that they just did not have housing that was available for their workforce all year round, and so Door County has taken the initiative to start a county-wide housing trust program to help sort of identify or to address that issue. And then kind of one of the things that sort of kind of popped up recently has been how some of the housing stock, when it does become available, gets snatched up by folks who are from the Chicago area who want to purchase it and use it as bed and breakfasts. So one of the things that we're playing around with is, can the community build workforce housing using a bed and breakfast sort of model? In other words, sort of like ripping the arm off your opponent and beating them over the head with it. So developing sort of a series of bed and breakfast sort of, or I'm sorry, not breakfast, but Airbnb that over time they can flip those into workforce housing and kind of use the lessons that the market is teaching them about Airbnbs and affordability and kind of using it to their own advantage. So that's kind of the other side of that story too.
Thank you.
Yeah, for whatever it's worth.
And what other comments do we have? I see that Aaron posted a link to community capitals as they're used in community food systems assessment and planning. Do we have any other comments or ideas out there?
That's one of the things about the Flores community capitals, is that it's really been embraced by a lot of different applications. Food systems, for example. There's been some others that I've seen out there. I actually believe that one of the counties, I want to say Buffalo County, actually used the community or the community capitals as a way to frame their impact statement. How their different programming was impacting various capitals within Buffalo County.
I see Kathleen has posted something on, and I'm going to mispronounce the last name, I think it's Sengi, on learning organizations encouraging a holistic approach via systems thinking. For that as well. Kathleen, I don't know if you're still on the line or not, but I don't know if you wanted to say something, and I think we might have lost Kathleen. Oh, there you are, Kathleen.
She's in the upper atmosphere.
She is.
Really Greenland from the air. I was flying over it, so it's really cool. Back in the day, I'm one of the more experienced educators in the extension system right now. And back in the day, there was a systems thinking and organizational learning team, and it was a blast. And we did a lot of work around organizational learning and systems thinking, and looking at issues such as what you brought up, Madeline, around tourism, and or looking at, do we diversify the business mix in the county, or do we focus on tourism? Systems thinking is looking at it with an and statement rather than an or statement. And then continuing to drill down, looking at what does that, sort of looking at what is the current reality and what is the desired reality, and drilling down from, here's an issue that popped up. Snow was really not very good this year. That affected our tourism. And then looking at what are the patterns, and that might be looking at what structures you have to look at, and then looking at what are the mental models of the folks that are working on the problem and you want to get involved with the issue. So that's just what I put on the chat box to help look at understanding systems thinking a little better.
Thank you, Kathleen. Any other questions or comments?
Just to go back to Madeline's comment or question, and for rural counties such as Washington, I think especially in the northern part of the state, these challenges really become pronounced, and it seems like the one solution is often only the tourism-based solution, just because that's a lot of these counties have an immense amount of natural resources, and seems to be the lowest hanging fruit. And I think what the Flora and Flora Capitals framework, as well as just systems thinking's approach, allows one to do is to kind of look at and expand beyond that low-hanging fruit capital that might be right on the forefront, and in your case, and in the northern part of the state, it's that natural capital. And I had done a presentation about 2 years ago to, it was actually in a county just over a couple counties over in the northern part. Again, they were even farther from any major metropolitan area, beautiful natural resources. It was the Glidden area. And they were looking and asking this exact question to say, well, what are other alternatives to doing economic development besides tourism-based? And I sort of used the community capitals framework as part of that presentation, but the point of the conversation that I had in that community was to sort of think beyond tourism, which is certainly a strength, but then to go to what Steve was talking about with, what are the amenities that you may have beyond natural capital, or where might you be lacking? So it could be a broadband question. It could be a human capital question. Maybe you actually have some really great human capital that you're sort of utilizing or sort of forgetting about in the process. What are the cultural capitals that you might have there that can be leaned on, and so forth. In the case of Washburn County, I mean, it's still pretty far from Duluth and the Twin Cities, but it's closer. I think it's under 100 miles from both, so you can tap into the agglomerate economy, these larger economies, and take advantage of that. So location or proximity could be helpful. And then the thing that I find incredible, sometimes out of necessity, but often I think it leads to an opportunity, is the entrepreneurial capacity of these places. So again, out of necessity, they're sort of required to engage in entrepreneurship just because of the seasonality of these. Oh, I have my dog. Sorry. She's stealing my thunder, so no. But again, I think that's an undertapped resource, and the community capitals will allow one to sort of take a systems look at what's happening in that community and say, wow, we have some entrepreneurial spirit in these communities that are doing some really original things and unique things, and maybe we can lean on that as sort of a strength of our community.
Excellent. I'm feeling like we could almost have a systems thinking pop-up learning community, but I'm saying that looking at several squares of people on here who could lead something like that effectively. So not me. I would be a learner in that group. So as we're wrapping up, if anyone does have an interest in forming something like that, maybe it would be the right time to start an email chain and put some plans together for a pop-up learning community around community capitals or systems thinking as related to community economic development. It might be an enjoyable and productive way to spend the next few weeks in between all of the other work that we're doing and adjusting to in this new situation. But with that, unless anyone has another comment, I think we will end at 1:02. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
you soon. Thank you very much, Steve, too. Thank you.